Hello and welcome to the Weekly Defence Podcast, the show about defence procurement and military technology. We are brought to you in partnership with our sponsor NAMO. I'm your host, Ben Vogel, news editor here at Shephard, and on the show this week, Senior Editor Naval Richard Thomas speaks with Richard Devlin, Head of Global Sales at submarine rescue system provider JFD, on the technological and environmental complexities encountered in the sector. Tim Martin, our editor-air, was in West Palm Beach last week, where 3 experimental helicopters flew together for the first time. He grabbed a chat with Sikorsky test pilot Bill Fell, who flew the Sikorsky-Boeing SB-1 Defiant coaxial demonstrator. And our sponsor NAMO provides this week's Industry Voice segment. But first, it's time for our weekly news round, and I'm joined by land reporter Flavia Camargos Pereira.
Hello, Ben.
And senior editor-air Tim Martin.
Hi, Ben.
But first, the Senate Armed Services Committee is taking testimony on the fiscal year 2021 budget proposal, but worried senators have also been asking about coronavirus. So let's hear a question from Senator Richard Blumenthal about the DoD's response, answered first by General Stephen Lyons, head of US Transportation Command, and then by General Todd Walters, NATO Supreme Commander, Europe.
What action has your command taken to mitigate the spread of COVID-19 and ensure the well-being of our service members and their families? And do you need additional resources? Is there more we can do to help you?
I agree with your concern, and the Secretary of Defense has indicated that protection of the force is his number one priority regarding the coronavirus. So U.S. Northern Command is the lead for the department, working very closely in support of Health and Human Services. We're connected with them on a daily basis, frequent number of times a day. So we're watching this very, very closely for any implications on global mobility.
What specific actions are you taking?
So we're not taking particular health protection measures inside the command other than to protect the force. But in a more broad sense, we're in support of Health and Human Services, and that's done through the lead of U.S. Northcom.
General Walters, do you feel you've been given the necessary resources and other tools to protect American servicemen and women and their families in Europe?
Yes, Senator, and we've also been given the appropriate authorities. As we speak, in Europe today, we have over 300 cases, and the nation that is most concerned is Italy, with 6 reported deaths. We've restricted travel to certain zones, and we require all Milair arrival flights to be screened for the virus.
So the Pentagon is clearly taking the coronavirus threat very seriously and putting measures into place to lower its potential impact. We will hear more about the coronavirus and its effect on the defence community in our Industry Voice segment at the end of the podcast. Staying in the US, Flavia, on the land domain, you listened into a briefing from Raytheon about a landmark in the lower-tier air and missile defense sensor program. Tell us more.
Yeah, Ben, Raytheon has announced the conclusion of the first radar antenna array to be added into the US Army LTAMDS. And this is the system that will replace the Patriot. And it'll be a big challenge because Patriot is a system that's spread around the world, that's used, that's in service in many countries. So to replace the system, it'll be a big challenge.
But for the time being, it's only the US that is going to be introducing this new array, I take it. How big is it, this array, compared to the legacy Patriot array? Yeah,
it's similar in size to the Patriot radar array. However, it can provide more than twice the Patriot's performance. So it will increase the capabilities of the U.S. Army, and it will improve the U.S. Army capabilities to provide missile defense.
Okay. And what will LTAMDS do as part of the broader missile defense infrastructure?
The LTAMDS, it's a next-generation radar system, and it will provide added capabilities, and it's capable of transmitting more powerfully and it will offer as well enhanced protection to defeat advanced air and missile threats.
So these are things like hypersonic missiles, I take it?
Exactly.
Well, it'll be very interesting to see how the program continues and whether or not any lessons that have been learned in development of LTAMDS can be applied to missile defence programs outside the United States. So we look forward to keeping an eye on that. But there have also been some interesting digitisation developments in France.
Yeah, France MOD has announced 4 digital innovations to the French army. And basically, the main focus is to simplify and to optimize the infantry operations and also the military routine. Basically, these four digital innovations are a multi-constellation satellite receiver that's called P3TS, a fully secured tablet called TIC, and 2 indigenously developed the software applications that's called DDAL and ICAR.
So let's talk about P3TS a little bit. In practical terms, what does it do for the soldier on the front line?
Yeah, it makes possible to geolocate allied vehicles. It doesn't matter if they are in a convoy or in a command center. This P3TS, it's integrated into the Scorpion program, and it's compatible with different satellite navigation systems. It can work with Galileo, GPS, and GLONASS. It's also compatible with the Blue Force tracking and with the 4th generation of Scorpio radio programs.
And what's the next step in development? I mean, are soldiers already using it?
These soldiers, the French army conducted some tests in the last year with the P3TS, and currently the project team is now using these results to develop a new version, a version 1.2 for this program. And the main focus is to provide higher security. The French MOD also said it's possible to organize a call for tender for a full-scale production of this system.
I see. Thank you very much, Flavia. And Tim, welcome back to the UK from your busy visit last week.
Yes, thanks so much, Ben. Yeah, I was in Florida with Sikorsky, looking at, as you mentioned, 3 at the top of the programme, 3 experimental test aircraft. But
you've also been very busy here as well, just back from a visit to the RAF club up in town. The RAF seems to be sort of sounding a note of caution about the rush towards information dominance. Can you explain a bit more?
Yes, of course can. So the briefing at the RAF club was with some other trade journalists, and it was really listening in on Assistant Chief of the Air Staff, AVM Ian Gill, and he was talking about the issues that go alongside implementing faster data transfer processes. I think was quite interesting because he was saying that you really have to bear in mind that if you get these types of processes wrong, you're potentially compromising C2 data and things of that nature, and that can spell absolute disaster for the Air Force. But not to kind of focus on just that element. He was also give a very clear example to say to look at some of the issues that are going on between the UK government and Huawei, the Chinese mobile phone manufacturer.
It's a very hot political potato at the moment, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. But I think that the point that he was trying to make here was that, and if we look at that example in particular, so the UK government have granted Huawei access to 5G access with restrictions, it should be said. But not only the scale of that effort, but also the kind of the difficulties in going forward with it and the troubles that sit alongside it. Really, I suppose, do show that there is logic to the line of thinking in that, yes, the push to have data quicker and faster is all well and good, and necessary in terms of this information dominance kind of agenda the RAF have. But at the same time, there has to be careful consideration given here to how you do it and the ways in which you do it. I think that's in effect what he was saying.
It's interesting that this sort of questioning of the need to get information quickly, there's this questioning only just now seems to have arisen. Presumably these kind of concerns have been bubbling away in the background for a while.
Yeah, I mean that's certainly true, but I think from the Assistant Chief of the Air Force's perspective, and he did say this also, the procurement decisions that have been taken by the RAF have really have been critical to thinking along those lines in data transfer. And he really gave a firm account of the air assets that are coming online, what differences they'll make in terms of acting as secure data hubs in the sky and improving capabilities. For example, he was mentioning the radar that sits on the E7, the AWACS, which is Northrop Grumman's L-band MESA. He was also talking about the Poseidon acting as as an aircraft that's, to paraphrase, at the high end of data interoperability. There is, I suppose, clear evidence from the RAF that the procurement decisions that they've made are progressing well, and Poseidon, the first of the aircraft, was delivered to RAF Lossiemouth on February. So that's the first of 9, and then you'll have the E7s, 5 of those coming online further down the track, and also Protector then that's going to be in service from 2024.
And looking a bit further ahead, I suppose the 6th generation Tempest fighter programme also ties in to a certain extent to this information dominance agenda as well. But bearing in mind the distance before that enters into service, and also bearing in mind the fact that there's a review that the UK government's undertaking of defence programmes this year, where does Tempest fit into that, in your opinion?
Yeah, I think in terms of the review that you mentioned, SDSR20, one of the big things that I'll be most interested in is how much money is allocated to Tempest, because there's $2 billion that sits in the budget for it now. But if we think back to something like Eurofighter, which is the aircraft that is going to precede Tempest, the development cost for that was $20 billion. So at the moment, you would have to think that all bets on a comparable figure for Tempest would be realistic. And if we're saying that only $2 billion has been offered at this stage, then it does seem that that's going to have to be one of the key decisions to be made by Boris Johnson's government.
Well, we will wait and see what the results of that review is. I'm not quite sure when the government will be reporting I think
results. You're like the rest of us, Ben. I don't think anyone is too clear on which day or date that is exactly going to go ahead.
We'll
but
keep our eyes open on that. Thank
absolutely.
you very much, Tim. And in terms of your busy visit to Florida last week, in the sun, lucky you, some promising signs for the Boeing Sikorsky Defiant candidate in FLRAA.
Yes, so as you mentioned, Boeing and Sikorsky have a joint venture on the SB-1 Defiant, and it was interesting to see it in full flight, and it managed to reach 130 knots at Sikorsky's facility in West Palm Beach. So it's a coaxial design, and that it's from Sikorsky and Boeing both putting faith in X2 technologies and pusher prop technologies, as well as in compared to a tail rotor, for example. So yeah, I mean, it was impressive to see, and I suppose it goes a long way to convincing journalists that the new concepts that are available and being developed on the rotary wing side of manufacturing are being thoroughly tested and are, as manufacturers,
very much
meet the claims,
Very much a case of seeing is believing.
Yeah, definitely.
From
Because,
your point of view.
JMRTD has been ongoing from 2012, 2013, and that's very much the beginning of these prototyping for future vertical lift. So, back then and for the last 4 or 5 years, I think on the media side, we've been hearing a whole lot about speed and range and survivability. Those have always been the buzzwords. And journalists have never been able to kind of say, well, show us your hand. What exactly how exactly are you going to do this? And beyond the designs that you're suggesting, let's have some evidence that these things really work. And I suppose it was a welcome step for the manufacturer to be able to say, well, here we are. This is how it flies, and we've always had the know-how to be able to do this.
So you witnessed Defiant in action, or at least in a test flight.
Yeah, exactly.
And there were some other experimental platforms that were test flown while you were there.
Yeah, that's right. So the S-97, which has been flight tested, Sikorsky said, for about 5 years, and that's going to be, a remodeled version will go forward for FARA, so it'll be heavier and have the future vertical lift T901 engine from General Electric as well. So, I mean, that's kind of some of just the smaller changes to the baseline S-97 that I saw fly. But yeah, it reached 180 knots and it had the pusher prop engaged and disengaged, which is, again, a significant difference to, the aerodynamics and technicalities of a tail rotor.
So that's the first time that they've publicly or semi-publicly
it's the first time that Defiant has been shown to journalists, and also the Defiant as well. The US Army were sat alongside us watching, so it was the first time that the US Army had been up close with it as well. So you saw it
for the first time at the same time as
exactly.
As the end user. That's quite interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Tim.
Yeah, thanks.
In other news, we have a story giving the latest example of Donald Trump's itchy trigger finger, as last week the US president prompted the resignation of Pentagon Policy Chief John Rood, who officially steps down on the 28th of February. There's no official reason why Trump has done this, but there's every chance that it's connected to the recently unsuccessful impeachment proceedings against him in the US Senate. Rood had said in December that Ukraine met a political reform precondition to receiving US aid that Trump allegedly withheld unless Ukraine investigated his political rivals. Now it looks like Rood is the latest victim of the presidential revenge rampage. For all information about the stories discussed this week, please visit our website. Coming up next, Tim Martin interviews test pilot Bill Fell at the Boeing Sikorsky Flight Test Media event in West Palm Beach, Florida.
Hey, did you know that Shephard Media is fully digital?
Yeah, of course. I've already downloaded the app. I love that I can access high-quality stories anywhere, anytime. That's good for when you're deployed, right?
I actually like that the stories don't waste my time. It's like the editors know what and when I want to read.
And that you don't have to read them. You can watch a video or check out the infographics.
Yeah, it's ace. Did you see that piece on Iran? That piece on the Tor M1 air defense system where they
Download the free Shephard News app on the App Store and Google Play, and you can get 3 months half price on Shephard Premium News for a limited time.
I'm Shephard Media's Air Editor, Tim Martin, and I'm delighted to say that I'm joined by Bill Fell, experimental test aircraft pilot at Sikorsky. And we're sat by the air hangar here at West Palm Beach in Florida, and we've just had on display the SB-1 Defiant coaxial helicopter, which, Bill, you've just flown and demonstrated some of the capabilities at low-level flights to not only trade media journalists, but the U.S. Army.
Yeah, right. I mean, I'm thrilled to be able to fly this fantastic machine here. The Defiant is really our third aircraft in our X2 technology group of aircraft. We started with X2 technology demonstrator. We went 260 knots in that machine. We've gone about 210 knots in the S-97 Raider, and now we've been out to close to 140 knots in the SB-1 Defiant, and we're teamed with Boeing on this great aircraft. And so beyond just the third in the series of these X2 tech demonstrators, we've proven the scalability of this aircraft. That X2 tech demonstrator was a 6,000-pound machine. Raider's like an 11,000-pound machine. And we're flying this aircraft right now at 30,000 pounds, and we expect to fly it at greater gross weights. And even though we've only gone to around 140 knots so far, we're doing that with 20% of the pusher prop capability and only 30% of the engine power capability. So you can expect a lot more from us in the near term.
Okay, and just to give listeners, I guess, a picture of how developments are moving forward and the configuration of the aircraft. I understand that within the cabin floor there's some steel plates bolted in, and that's really for mission representative standard to get it to about 30,000 pounds gross weight.
Yeah, that's right. We've got a couple of 1,000 pounds of steel plates in the back right now. You don't take an experimental aircraft out when you're trying to learn what the envelope is and load it up with people. For safety purposes, we keep minimum essential crew. So we do put steel plates back there to put it in not only the weight, representative weight, but the representative center of gravity as well.
And talk us through a little bit about kind of more of the impressive capabilities of the aircraft, because in particular, it's been mentioned today that the ability to fly at around 150 to 200 knots and then slowly brake is pretty much unlike anything that the helicopter manufacturing world has seen before. And that's going to be, from a mission perspective, that's going to be very useful if this is selected by the US Army further down the line.
Sure, yeah. The capability to decelerate in this machine is really phenomenal. I like to use the metric that in a half a mile we can go from 200 knots to a hover. And the pilot feels that tugging on their shoulder harnesses as they put negative thrust on the prop coming into that landing zone. And it's a really simple pilot user interface too, in that I have a beeper switch on the collective. I go full aft to put negative thrust on that prop. But then when I get into the hover, rather than having to beep that out to neutral thrust, I have a button that just takes it to a zero thrust condition. So it's get into the hover, hit the zero thrust condition, and now you're able to hover or land or even stop the prop if that's what you want to do.
And post-flight with the Defiant, the US Army were debriefed, and I looked from afar at you kind of telling them a little bit about the capabilities. What were the Army, some of the questions that they were asking you, and what were you kind of talking to them about?
I think just the general characteristics of the aircraft, the modern cockpit, the simple interface of the flight controls for the pilot, that it's similar. So when you fly this like a helicopter, it's exactly like any other helicopter. You have a cyclic control, you have a collective control, and you have pedals to control yaw. And in that respect, it's like every other helicopter in the world. And when you use the prop, you can either choose to use that or not to use that. So it's going to result in some very easily transferable skills from those aviators out there today, the Black Hawk and Apache pilots, that will be able to take into this very quickly. And so there were some questions on, training and those sorts of things. And I think that the fly-by-wire system, beyond the fact that you get some combat survivability out of it, because it's triplex. You get 3 of virtually anything. So the 3 of everything is not necessarily for combat survivability. It's just a fallout. The 3 of everything is because you want a system that can operate with high authority and high rate. And so the legacy non-fly-by-wire aircraft you only have simplex or duplex systems, and so you have to account for the fact that one of those systems can fail and result in a hard over, a very abrupt input to the flight controls. Well, so they limit the authority of these fast systems in it to so that the pilot has the opportunity to react to those. Well, in a fly-by-wire system that's triplex, the math says you're not going to get that hard over, and so you don't have to account for it. So it makes the handling so much better, that it's crisper, that the authority is such that when the pilot tells that system to do something, it always holds that condition, and it just makes it that much easier to fly.
And we've a little way to go before talking about full rate production for this. I mean, maybe 10 years and beyond before, we reach that stage. But from maybe a training perspective, and the Army will have ideas on this themselves, but how many flight hours, for example, might be needed before, pilots could use this kind of fairly comfortably?
I mean, honestly, like anybody that's already a helicopter pilot, I can train to fly it very well in the simulator in less than 5 hours. They're in an hour they get it and they know how to fly it, and just a little bit of extra time so that they really get it. When the Army trains pilots, it's not always about flying the machine. A lot of it is about fighting the mission and the maneuvers we're going to do to fight the mission. And the skills that they already have for those other Army aircraft are transferable to this.
And in terms of the development itself, Sikorsky's working with propulsion test system bed, or propulsion system test bed. What are the advantages of that? And is the thinking behind that is generally thought that once you program a lot of software and hardware inputs to that system, they're able to kind of match what you can do on the aircraft itself.
Yeah, so the propulsion system test bed is kind of an iron bird that it's bolted to the ground. It has all of the components, most all of the components of the aircraft. It has the rotor system, the prop system, the engines, the flight control system, and we basically abuse that test stand. We put high powers through those gearboxes. We put a lot of thrust on the prop and the rotors, such that we're able to see early if there's going to be any problems with any of those components.
Just to give kind of a picture of your working week with this aircraft, because it's flying at currently once a week. So what does that involve from, preparing and, to flight clearances to all of that? Can you give us a picture of that?
Sure, yeah. We have our test simulators in Connecticut. So we'll go up to Connecticut. We'll fly the exact mission that we plan to fly in a simulator in Connecticut. We will iterate on that and assume that we're going to have certain emergencies happen so that we're prepared for all of that. We'll look at what the predicted loads are based on the models that we've developed for this aircraft and ensure that we have margin to operate the aircraft. And, but sometimes you see that, it looks like the margin's going to be tight in a particular area. And so you're more careful there when you get to the aircraft, and you build up a little more incrementally to that point to see, is that real, or is that just that we have an imperfect model?
Maybe a little bit of a discussion on moving the envelope, so moving beyond 130, 160 knots. Not only why that's so important, but can you accelerate that timeline at all, or will the focus be just to continue as planned?
Yeah, I think that we are reaching our stride here now, that we've flown every week this year, and we expect to continue flying it with great regularity and increasing the envelope in roughly 40 knot increments, that we check the stability of the system every 40 knots. And so that requires some very detailed test maneuvers, as well as some detailed engineering analysis when we complete that. So when we complete a flight, the engineers go through all of the structural data on the aircraft, all of the thermal data, the stability analysis of the flight control system, and they tabulate all of that data. We do a data review where everybody goes over it and is able to ask questions, and everybody gives the thumbs up. Okay, good. I think we're set, and we're going to go on to the next increment. So it ends up being that you require just about a week between those test flights to accomplish all of that, especially as you're also preparing for that next flight in the simulator and coming back to Connecticut.
Bill, it's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you, and we look forward to hearing more of the developments with Defiant, and particularly as it pushes towards 200 knots and beyond.
Yeah, my pleasure. Yeah. I hope to tell you more and tell you about how fast we're going, maybe at Quad A in April.
Great. Thanks again, Bill.
While the podcast is a newer venture for Shephard Media, we've actually been in the defence publishing business for almost 40 years and have built up a strong and loyal audience base. Our content is trusted and consumed by key decision makers through Shephard Media's multiple channels. One benefit of having such a dedicated audience base is our ability to offer a comprehensive range of message delivery options to our advertisers. From brand awareness campaigns across a combination of print and digital media, through targeted email campaigns or show dailies, to a multitude of online opportunities, or even advertising opportunities within the podcast itself. If you'd like to know more, please visit shepherdmedia.com/advertising.
Submarines are among, if not the most complex of naval platforms ever developed, operating in the most extreme conditions that our planet can bring to bear, hundreds of feet below the surface of the ocean. Imagine then the complexities involved in conducting a rescue operation on a submarine in distress. UK-based JFD operates in this space, providing rescue systems and a range of other equipment to civil and defence sectors. Joining me on the Weekly Defence Podcast is Richard Devlin, Global Head of Defence Sales. Mr. Devlin, hello.
Hello, how are you, Richard?
I'm very well, thank you very much. So, how complex is the nature of submarine rescue?
Well, in short, it's very complex, Richard. We've got multiple variables that we need to deal with should there be a dis-sub event anywhere in the world. So our challenge is to mobilise equipment, so roughly about 200 to 250 tonnes of equipment, people, logistics, mobilise all that onto aircrafts, onto ships, to get to the dis-sub location in the fastest time possible.
What sort of characteristics do rescue submersibles need to have?
Well, in their nature, they need to be quite flexible. So from a technical point of view, the materials we select need to be lightweight in their nature. There's multiple trade-offs that you need to make sure you've got the right capacity, you can achieve the correct depth, but also you can make the submersible as light as possible such that it can be transported by air, by road, or by rail. So in that regard, there's a lot of design effort that goes into to make sure that we've got the trade-offs right such that we can effect a rescue as soon as possible.
You mentioned just in your previous answer about the time constraints that you have to operate in. Can you just give us an idea as to, I guess, the very, very tight time constraints, and you're not really able to miss the deadline, are you?
Well, not really. If we miss the deadline, then unfortunately people don't survive, and that's the nature of the serious business that we're involved in. All of our rescue systems around the world, we endeavour to mobilise them, embark them onto a ship and sail that ship to the disabled submarine within 72 hours. So all efforts need to be contained within those timeframes. Because beyond that, as you start to get into the rescue evolution, obviously the oxygen and life support on board the submarine starts to diminish quite fast, subject to how compromised the disabled submarine is. So submarine rescue is always a race against the clock. And in that regard, all of our processes, all of our procedures, the way that we maintain and look after the system needs to be optimised to ensure that as best as possible, we can achieve the 72 hours.
Okay, so this sort of capability has been around for some time. I'm assuming that the global market is also shifting and sort of changing in that regard. How is it currently? in sort of the demand for your systems and your capabilities and the services?
Well, what we're seeing around the world at the moment, Richard, is a demand for submarine rescue services, mainly because of the increase in production of in-service submarines. So if we look at the regions around the world, Asia Pacific, for example, there's a lot of nations buying submarines in that part of the world. So with that comes the need to protect the lives of submariners at depth. In addition to that, incidents, very sad incidents, such as the San Juan incident, the Argentinian submarine that went missing. In that regard, in Latin America, those nations are looking at the challenges that operating submarines brings. And with that, they're looking at companies like JFD to ensure that they've got rescue cover from now into the future.
How about the technology required to complete a submarine rescue? How's that changed? And there's also a naval submarine code that has been developed that would guide a lot of navies' use of submarines in the safety practices. So is that sort of overarching international regulatory framework assisting maybe how you work, how you develop your technology, or is it separate from that?
I would say it augments what we do in terms of how the technology has evolved over the generations. What I would say is that we're probably into the third evolution of technology for submarine rescue, and events in the world have dictated that development. So, for example, in the 80s, the technology was aligned to making sure that a submersible could mate successfully with a disabled submarine. Thereafter, the Kursk incident happened in year 2000, and that led to a realisation that when a submarine goes down, then one of the compartment hulls within the submarine could be compromised, which would lead to an increase in pressure in that compartment. So that when you get the people back on board the mothership and start to treat them, you need to make sure that you've got the right hyperbaric complexes set up. So technology has been almost driven by events in history. Where we're at today is, from a submarine rescue point of view, we have demonstrated time upon time over the years that the technology does work, so we can achieve a successful mate and transfer personnel from a disabled submarine into a rescue submersible. So the main challenge for companies like JFD at the moment is how to decrease what we call the time to first rescue. So how do we make systems smaller, be able to go on a greater selection of ships around the world, and ultimately get to that point as fast as possible?
You mentioned there the hyperbaric aspect to the whole rescue mission. I mean, I guess it isn't just as simple as connecting with the submarine in distress, pulling the crew out and getting to the surface, is it?
No, indeed it's not. Once you have the rescuees in the submersible, that submersible then ascends back to the surface. It's then recovered onto a mothership for which we will already have embarked a full hyperbaric complex. So our third generation system at the moment can take 90 persons. So at any one time, we can have up to 90 people from the disabled submarine being treated for a variety of decompression type illnesses. And in that regard, we would work very closely with the host nation and the medics of that particular navy to make sure that even though the people are back on the ship, they don't fall out of any follow-on illnesses as a result of being at pressure.
Okay, what sort of key milestones is JFD looking to meet in 2020? I think just recently we saw the continuation of JFD Australia with its sort of services to the Australian Navy. So what sort of milestones can you kind of sort of point the listeners towards through the rest of this year?
Yeah, Australia is a very important market for us. So we've signed a nice extension there to provide the continued rescue service. In Europe, we run the NATO submarine rescue contract, which is a tri-party agreement between UK, France and Norway. We've had another 3-year extension to that contract, so we'll service those 3 countries under that. In Singapore, we've just completed a major refit out there of the system, so that system's good for another 10 years, which is fantastic. From a project delivery point of view, we've successfully delivered 2 of our third generation systems to India, one located on the east coast, one located on the west coast. Now that the acquisition phase of the project is complete, we will go into a 25-year through-life support contract. So at present, we're starting to ramp up that, which entails employing people locally, investing locally, and supporting the Indian customer for quite a long period, as I say, 25 years. In addition to that, we're also building some submersibles for different navies around the world. So we've successfully signed a contract with Daewoo Shipyard, who are building a submarine rescue vessel for the Korean customer. And as part of that, we will deliver the deep submerged rescue vehicle towards June 2021.
It just occurred to me, sorry, just a very quick follow-on question, that with the increased proliferation of submarines and the demand for your services and systems, is there a demand obviously on the sort of production capacity and personnel capacity of JFD as well?
Yeah, I think any business's challenge is to scale accordingly. JFD are very fortunate in that we've got over 30 years of both designing, manufacturing, testing, commissioning and operating submersibles around the world. So we've managed to meet that challenge head on, scale up the business accordingly. And also over the last few years, we've made a number of acquisitions, which has given us more real estate or manufacturing capacity to look at either manufacturing some of these vehicles or manufacturing subsystems of these vehicles that we can then bring to the UK for final assembly.
Mr. Devlin, many thanks for your time.
Thank you.
So welcome to the part of the show that we like to call Industry Voice. This is a segment of the show that's brought to you in partnership with our sponsor, Namo. I'm Tony Skinner, VP of Content here at Shephard Media. And on the line, I've got friend of the podcast, Andre Lons, who's the SVP of Communications for Namo. First of all, good morning, Andre.
Morning, Tony.
So I guess this week we want to sort of touch on the big story that's dominating headlines around the world, which is the lingering effects of the coronavirus. We were just at the Singapore Air Show a couple of weeks ago, where the show was heavily disrupted by the virus itself, with companies staying away. The footfall was really heavy. It was very light on the show floor. Although it has to be said that everything ran very well, and in Singapore itself, it was kind of business as usual. A couple of weeks on, we are sort of seeing that things appear to be amplified, and there are cases popping up around the globe. I guess first of all, from a corporate point of view, from somebody who does business around the world, I mean, how is Namo looking at this, and how are you guys reacting to the crisis?
Yeah, I think there's, for us, just as everyone else in the industry, I think there are three lessons that we need to draw from this, and that we need to carry with us going forward, not just in the current crisis, but in the future as well, because, we're going to face this again. This comes up every now and then. But I think the first one that we've learned, and I think everyone else needs to be aware of, is we can't really expect to be unaffected by this. I mean, even if we personally or none of our employees catch this themselves, we will face second and third order effects. I mean, the effects you mentioned on the Singapore Air Show is an obvious one, where just the disruption caused by this outbreak actually does have a direct impact on our day-to-day business. So we cannot shrug it off. We have to actually take it seriously and be prepared to deal with those disruptions. And I think the second thing we have to be aware of is that this, once again, just highlights how interconnected we are today, both in terms of supply chains, but also in terms of travel and just those relationships, cross-border relationships that we depend on. And I think we have to recognize that the more dispersed your operations are and more dispersed your supply chain is, the more vulnerable you're going to be. And we have to look into that and take it seriously. And I think the third and final point I want to make is that we have to assume that someone is watching and learning, and not necessarily in the way we would hope they did. There are people watching and learning from this in terms of how can disruption of this kind be exploited, if not necessarily instigated or created, but exploited in an effort to achieve other goals. What we're seeing again here is that fear is one of the greatest motivators, and fear is one of those biggest disruptors of any society today. And our current media reality is amplifying it. and is creating a massive knock-on effects on societies beyond the immediate disruption of those being personally affected that we'll have to deal with. And that final one, I think, is extremely important because if someone does decide to exploit this at some point, that's the time that we in the defense and security business are going to be required to continue operating. That's when they're really going to need us. That's when they're going to expect us to be there for them, national governments, armed forces, because that's when they have to deliver. And then they need the industry partners to be there as well. So then we have to be able to deal with the disruption and continue operating.
I mean, on that final point, in terms of the role of the media here, we did see President Donald Trump downplay the threats to a certain extent. He's saying that the risk to the US is very low, and I mean, okay, he's not one to miss an opportunity to beat up on the media, but he is saying that a lot of this is overblown. Yeah, I guess it's an interesting point that the responsible reporting and not letting fear become that sort of motivator, or not to let this get out of hand or be used for nefarious purposes. While also I guess approaching
and that's something we have to be aware of, right? But at the same time, we shouldn't be naive in the sense that we can't expect people to not be concerned.
Sure,
I think that's also unrealistic. And it needs to be taken seriously in the sense that this is an outbreak that will have implications. I was looking at the official guidance from Norwegian Institute of Public Health, which came up this week, and even in their conservative estimates, they're looking at a lethality of the virus at about 10 times that of the regular seasonal flu. And so it's not exactly the Black Plague we're talking about here, but it will have an impact beyond what we will see on a daily basis or like every year. So it needs to be taken seriously and we need to deal with it. But I think we have to be aware of these other factors, and we have to be aware of what this shows us about how vulnerable we are and what it shows us about how that vulnerability could potentially be exploited, and what we as a defense and security industry then have to do and will be expected to do to respond.
I mean, I think your points about the supply chain is very interesting and obviously very relevant from a defense industry point of view. I guess there could be disruption to the supply of parts and everything else. The other thing that I guess is curious is as events are maybe downscaled or even cancelled, it may cast a pretty heavy spotlight on the ability of people to sort of meet face-to-face in order to do business, and the importance that plays in the annual kind of calendar. Whether people still need to be at presence at these big events where, the advice is to avoid crowds, at the end of the day.
Yeah, but I think those are more temporary effects in the sense that we will not stop meeting and we have to continue doing that, but we have to be able to then compensate during times like this when we can't. And I guess the biggest lesson from that is that we have to assume that these kinds of disruptions to those physical events can come from any source, right? It's not just during a disease outbreak or anything like that we might expect that sort of restrictions to have an impact on the industry. So we have to be able to maintain our relationships and build those connections even during times of disruption. There could be a lot of different causes for it, right? So we have to be able to maintain relationships and have ways of keeping in touch without necessarily having those in-person meetings. And I think we could do that, and I think on a temporary basis or short-term basis, I don't think that's going to have a big impact on the industry. But I think just the vulnerability of society at large and the kind of second or third order effects that this will have on industry is something that we have to be very aware of and have to take seriously.
I mean, it does highlight, I guess, the fact that we've gone through a long period of stability where these kind of disruption isn't something that we have had to factor into our sort of daily lives. So,
yeah, exactly. And it just shows also how much we take for granted.
Yeah.
How much we take it for granted that things will work out or that these things will always be possible, available. Well, they won't. And I think that's something that is, in a sense, a ghoulish way of a useful reminder of how how much we have taken for granted and how the dangers of doing that.
Andre, we're out of time, but fascinating as always, and look forward to speaking to you next time. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
This episode of the Weekly Defence Podcast was brought to you in partnership with our sponsor, NAMO. As always, a big thanks to everyone who took the time to be part of this episode. And for our listeners, make sure you like and subscribe, leave a review on iTunes, tell a friend or a colleague about the podcast. Until next time, thanks for listening.